Okay, so good evening to everybody. Thank you so much for joining this space. Welcome. My name is Melissa Lamina, the Communications and Legal Officer for the International Commission of Jurists Africa program. I'm also joined by our intern, Mariam Diallo, who's going to be co-hosting with me. It gives me great pleasure to be in conversation with Laura Lopez Gonzalez, independent health and science writer, and public health lawyer Sephora Abdul Karim. I won't get into the details of their very impressive CVs because I would like them to introduce themselves properly in a little bit for the listeners who will be joining soon. But first, I'll just provide a little bit of background to the listeners that we have with us so far. Thank you so much for joining. So this discussion forms part of our Equality Not Charity campaign as the ICJ to promote the right to health and equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines for all. The campaign is also a further call to states to fulfill their international human rights obligations to ensure the rights to health, life, equality, and science by, amongst other things, disseminating important COVID-19 information, providing equal access to vaccines, and addressing barriers to vaccine access. And we have joined various other organizations in advocating for states to adopt a waiver of intellectual property rights for COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics. So, for Laura, I'm sure as you already know, or as you definitely know, October 2020 saw India and South Africa propose a landmark IP waiver for COVID-19 medical tools to the World Trade Organization. And just last month, during the World Trade Organization's 12th Ministerial Conference in Geneva, member states finally reached a decision on the TRIPS agreement waiver. And this decision text clarifies existing public health safeguards, gives members greater scope to take direct action to diversify production of COVID-19 vaccines, and override patents through a very targeted waiver that will operate over the next 5 years. So I'm really excited to be picking your brains about the long-term effects of this decision on access to COVID-19 vaccines, especially in lower-income countries. So I'll just ask a few questions to start off with, and then we will open up the floor for questions and comments if we get any at all. But that being said, I think we can maybe dive straight into it. Maybe Laura and Sephora, you can give a very brief introduction about what you do and your interest in this particular topic. Sephora, you think you can start?
Thanks so much for having me, and good evening to everyone. My background is that I am a public health lawyer who was previously at the Wits School of Public Health. I've been working on issues around COVID-19 vaccine equity since March of 2020, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I think it's incredibly important, and I'm very excited to be joining Lara, who's an expert in her own right.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Laura, take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here and also to be chatting with Sephora, who is really just such a talented person and really great about unpacking the ways that business shapes our access to healthcare in so many ways. What we're about to talk about is one of them. I'm a health journalist. I've been based in Johannesburg, South Africa for the last 17 years, where I've covered health here in South Africa and then sort of in the region and globally. And I've been following vaccine equity basically since the pandemic began. So I think this is a really important discussion that we're having today to unpack what sort of went right, what sort of went wrong with the waiver discussions and how that might influence pandemic preparedness going forward.
Amazing. Thank you both so much for those introductions. And I'm very excited to be talking to both of you about this. And I think that you'll have some very valuable insights to share with us on this very important issue, as you've already outlined. So, Laura, I think we can start with you, just to get you talking again. What do you consider to be the most important thing that you want the public to know about the patent waiver that was agreed upon at the ministerial conference?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think maybe before we start, I think you provided some wonderful background to the waiver discussion, but I think it's worth sort of maybe taking a step back and really unpacking a little bit about what South Africa and India first proposed. So the original waiver that was proposed would have waived a range of intellectual property protections, not just patents, but also for the protection of trade secrets, for example, on a range of COVID-19 tools from vaccines to tests to medicines to ventilators. That waiver, proposed almost 2 years ago, was supported by about 100 countries. Many of the provisions in that waiver are already afforded to countries technically as part of existing international trade laws that recognize the link between intellectual property and the ability to access healthcare, and that these are linked. And so many of those provisions in the existing law that have been have yet to be enacted locally into many countries' laws, which prevent countries from taking advantage of these flexibilities, which are often called TRIPS flexibilities. So the India-South Africa waiver would have allowed many countries to use these provisions already afforded to them under international law, without having to ratify them locally, is my understanding, and also while not fearing repercussions. Because historically, rich countries like the United States have played very much by a do as I say, not as I do sort of rules. So the U.S. has threatened the use of compulsory licenses. These are licenses where the government can say, listen, we need a vaccine or medicine to be imported without the patent holder's permission because we are facing a public health emergency. The U.S. has threatened to do this when it, for instance, needed access to anthrax treatments, but historically has not liked when other countries do this. So that usually comes out in the form of pressure countries experience with trade negotiations with larger companies or countries. So the U.S. was also the only country to issue a compulsory license during the pandemic, and that was to protect Moderna. And of course, they funded a large part of the Moderna vaccine development. So after more than 20 months of negotiations and more than 15 million people dying, the waiver that the world got is really a shadow of what was initially proposed.
Thank you so much, Laura. I think that background was definitely very, very useful to kind of bring us up to this point now. And I think that's a really good time to also bring Sephora into this conversation too. Sephora, could you tell us, like, how does this WTO ministerial decision on the waiver compare to South Africa and India's proposal for the temporary waiver, and how will this waiver actually work in practice? Just following up to the background that Laura has already given.
So Laura is completely correct in that the original waiver sort of sought to build on what's known as the Doha Declaration, which was something that was reached about almost 2 decades ago, more like 15 years ago, that attempted to introduce certain flexibilities around things that were considered public health emergencies. What we've learned in the subsequent decade or so is that the Doha Declaration is woefully inadequate, but it's particularly inadequate when it comes to vaccines. And I think part of understanding why it's inadequate comes with the fact that when it comes to access to vaccines, we are dealing with more than just intellectual property and patent protection. I often categorize the legal impediments to equitable vaccine access as threefold. The first is that there is proprietary information such as patents, and also, more importantly, technological know-how and trade secrets. And this sort of concoction or melting pot of 3 factors is a huge barrier to the ability to manufacture vaccines outside of patented protection. The second factor is regulation and the ability to recognize generic vaccines that are often effectively the same but manufactured in different ways. So if you think about India, for example, reverse engineering a vaccine, it's often quite complicated for them to get regulatory approval for that vaccine in the same way that one would find for the original version. And the third is manufacturing capacity. Now, when I separate those out into 3 silos, that doesn't mean that they're independent of each other. In fact, what we've seen is that these 3 facets are deeply, deeply interlinked. And I think, the clearest example of this is, again, the Moderna vaccine. So Moderna had indicated that if countries in the global south wanted to manufacture their vaccine, they would not exercise their IP protections. As soon as a manufacturing proposal was created to produce a generic version, they began to file patent protections and threatened to use their patent protections to block that manufacturing. What I need to underscore in all of this is that these are problems that have existed for the last 4 decades. And unfortunately, what has happened through this entire process, Laura was completely correct in categorizing the current waiver as a shadow of what was previously proposed. And I think the lesson we can take out of this, which has been the lesson that I think people have been calling for since early 2020, is that the current regime of intellectual property and trade, as it applies to health technologies is woefully inadequate, and this waiver process has just completely illustrated that.
Right, I think that your sentiments, I think, are also shared by many NGOs who expressed extreme disappointment with the decision, saying, amongst other things, that they feel like it wasn't a true intellectual property waiver that was decided on, and deviated quite significantly from the original proposal. And so, is there anything at all that is redeeming about this particular waiver? And Laura, I'll pose this question to you now. Is there anything at all that it gets right? Maybe the decision-making process itself, or the actual waiver. Is there anything at all that it gets right?
I think it was a very disappointing sort of process to watch unfold. So you had this moment of global South solidarity. You had people really pushing in very that original waiver is very sensible. It says you give us access to these tools for a limited amount of time. We can control the pandemic, and then you see this just inaction and bickering and countries asking for more clarifications when South Africa and India felt like they'd already done it. So I feel like I'm hesitant to say that it got much right, but I do think what it did do for us, and I think this has been echoed by people who are much smarter than me, is I think for a new generation that maybe wasn't around during the early years of HIV that really proved or sort of showed us that intellectual property rights are linked with our access to healthcare. For a new generation, this pandemic and these waiver negotiations have really cemented the fact that intellectual property and your healthcare are very much linked, or in blunter term, corporations shape our health in many ways, which is something that Sephora and I have often had chats about.
So I think I'll also pose the question to you, Sephora. Are there any, I think, Laura, you've kind of illustrated the very few, maybe, I guess, like silver linings to this, is that at least it's kind of brought these issues to the fore and really kind of brought it really to our attention. Sephora, do you think there are any silver linings to the ministerial decision on the TRIPS agreement, if at all?
So I had to think very, very, very hard about what silver linings might exist, and there are two in my mind. The first is when I mentioned the three prongs. The waiver is quite clear about the need for what we call mutual recognition of regulatory processes. So it seeks to encourage member states to kind of streamline regulatory processes. And that's really important. It sounds boring. Every time I bring it up, people are a little bit yawning. But in fact, regulatory processes can delay access by up to 7 years. So that's quite important. But it's a cop-out because the WTO doesn't actually exercise any powers in respect of regulatory approvals for medications or health technologies more broadly. So it's great that they said that, but they actually have no role to play in that. So it's kind of a hollow statement. The second silver lining is, I think, this. Laura mentioned that there were over 100 countries that supported this waiver. That doesn't even cover the sort of civil society and broader support that this waiver had. It was incredible the amount of solidarity there was behind the original proposal. What this process tells us is two things. The first is, even in a groundbreaking, world-changing, unprecedented pandemic, business interests prevail. And the second thing it teaches us is that the IP system is fundamentally broken when it comes to health technologies. I'm sure it's broken in other respects, but at least in that respect, we know this now. We know that even if hundreds of countries support this, it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. A few controlling interests will have more of a say on whether or not you can get a jab than the majority of world leaders and the majority of the world's population. And I think that's a very important lesson we need to learn. We also, I think, as advocates in this space, that COVID was a massive opportunity to begin to reshape what the IP system looks like for health technologies more broadly. And what this shows us is that we can't rely on these systems. We need to really build from the ground up what equitable access looks like.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those very important sentiments. And I think that being said as well, how do you think that the current waiver could be revised or should be improved upon? If you had an opportunity to be a part of this process and to really kind of play like a really big role in drafting the text, how would you have revised or improved upon it?
I'm assuming that was directed to me, but I'll let Laura also answer that one. Look, I'm not gonna lie. The original proposal was great. I think a lot of advocates in the affordability of medicine space would have probably wanted it to apply to more than just COVID. But, the reality is we need a Doha Declaration moment for vaccines. It was acknowledged, I think, in something like 2005 that the Doha Declaration was inadequate to deal with vaccines. And so we do need something that will do for vaccines what the Doha Declaration did for the affordability of HIV treatment. I think really we need, because the original waiver understood kind of not just the breadth of the products that needed to be covered, but the scope of what types of things needed to be covered, not just patents, but trade secrets, know-how, capacity building, regulatory issues. All of those issues really needed to be encompassed. It's not about a narrow issue of is there a patent or not. This is not about a narrow issue of, well, let's allow production in low and middle income countries, except those, by the way, that have manufacturing capacity. And I must say, when I was looking at it today, I was mildly outraged at the fact that there's a statement there that encourages low and middle income countries that have vaccine manufacturing capacity to opt out of the waiver. It really begs the question, what is the point of the waiver then? If you're saying to countries that have manufacturing capacity, well, please opt out, then really who is this waiver for? Because you can't build vaccine manufacturing capacity at a meaningful scale in 5 years. And even if you could, it's a little bit too late at that point for COVID. So the whole thing just seemed really, really hollow and pointless. I'm probably sounding very pessimistic, but I have to say, looking at it, one has to wonder what was the intention here, because it doesn't seem to be to ensure equitable vaccine access. It seems to have been more of posturing and a straw man of a waiver rather than something meaningful.
And Laura, what are your thoughts on that as well? What do you think, how does it make you feel about the future impact of this waiver on accessibility to COVID-19 vaccines, as well as tools such as therapeutics that aren't covered in this decision? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that what Safar just sort of ended on there is so powerful. I think it's also really interesting to say that, or to look back on some of the pharmaceutical industry arguments against the waiver for the last 2 years. And they were like, the main tenet of those arguments was, if we gave you the patents, it wouldn't be enough for you to increase production. And then what did they do in the waiver? The countries sort of, you could arguably influenced by pharmaceutical companies, they gave us the patents, and that's all they gave us. So I think it's quite disingenuous in a lot of ways. I think it, unfortunately, this waiver doesn't do anything to deal with the asymmetries that we're already seeing with COVID, access to COVID treatments, which have already fallen prey to the same kind of nationalism that we saw with vaccines. It doesn't put tests in the hands of many countries that need them to run proper responses. What I think I'm more sort of encouraged by is that I think COVID was a moment where a lot of countries, especially in Africa, started to do things that I think we've been told for a lot of reasons couldn't be done before. So, for the first time, the African Union has been talking about increasing local production of vaccines and medicines for more than 10 years. This is the first time we've seen honest, real concerted movement around it. There's a long way to go in terms of what that means for development, sustaining that development, and really harnessing the continent's buying power. But for me, that's what I found most hopeful about it, is that the shocking behavior we saw by rich countries really, I think, prompted African countries at least to figure out a way to do for themselves in future pandemics.
And I think you both touched on something very important there, is that clearly the higher income countries were not interested in any kind of international solidarity and really cooperating to kind of to help improve vaccine manufacturing capacity, to help improve equitable access to vaccines. But it's created a very important moment, I think, for African countries in particular, countries in the global south, to really decide for themselves how they want to handle these things, and to really examine how we can kind of take matters into our own hands, I think. So I guess I don't want to be too bleak about this, but what kind of precedent do you think that this decision sets for access to health? Oh, Sephora, I think you've got your hand up. Would you like to make a comment there?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to pick up on something that Lara raised that's so important, and you've been alluding to as well, which is one thing that this entire process, not just the TRIPS process, but COVID in sort of more general terms, has showed us is that the best solutions for Africa are homegrown solutions by Africans. And I speak specifically as a member of both the African CDC's Vaccine Delivery Alliance and the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing. Both of these initiatives have been exactly the kind of groundbreaking solidarity and partnerships that we need to move things forward in Africa. Yes, they're going a bit slower, they're underfunded, etc. They're severely hamstrung by kind of the global hoarding of vaccines, etc. But those solutions that have come out of the Africa CDC have really been the kinds of things that we are advocating for. And more support around that, I think that's maybe what this waiver can show us, is that we need to throw our weight behind these types of solutions. We need to rely on our regional bodies rather than leaning on things like the WTO. That's all I wanted to say.
Laura, please go for it.
Yeah, I think just to echo what Sephora was saying, I think, when you look at the mRNA hub that was established by the World Health Organization in Cape Town, with the aim of being able to develop an mRNA vaccine and being able to share that with any country that wanted it, in the media that got billed as South African scientists have made a copy or have duplicated or but what they really did was they borrowed, or they took what was in the patent applications, right, and what was publicly known, but they were local research being done on things like hepatitis B, for instance, which really is an African problem, to be able to do all of that kind of preclinical work in less than a year. So I think it's also revealed a lot of capacity on the continent. We're leading in terms of genomic sequencing in many ways. And I think the other thing that I think was really fascinating about it is, for a lot of, I come from an HIV background, and then, that community has been asking, for decades almost, for, can we get 3 months supplies of ARVs? Can we get over to my door? Can you make it easier for me to get my treatment? And all of a sudden, these things that we kept being told, we have to wait, we can't do it yet, all of a sudden, possible under COVID. So I think it really became like a point that for kind of it showed that we could innovate, and it showed that we could innovate when that was sort of demanded of us in terms of our health system. So I think that there's a lot of positives in the way that, for instance, that Africa responded to the pandemic.
And I think before I get into opening up the floor for any questions and comments, I think that's a good segue into my last question for both of you, which is that with the pandemic treaty that is currently being negotiated, do you both foresee that it is likely to deal with this issue of the waiver? Do you think it'll likely be on the agenda? Do you think it'll appear in the text in the context of future pandemics? Do you see it being kind of an urgent issue that is dealt with in the pandemic treaty negotiations? Sephora, let's start with you.
So this is a complicated issue, because I think one of the big problems with pandemic preparedness from a legal perspective is that it's often driven by high-income countries, and it's very self-protective. A lot of the initiatives that get traction are not those that are about equity or a moral imperative or human rights, but rather about how can we protect our own population. It's the same reason why we've had almost no development on malaria and TB treatment, but have seen, huge strides in, for example, things that affect largely high-income countries. It's the same reason why we've waited so long for hepatitis breakthroughs. So I think, it's a challenge. I think the second challenge that emanates from the pandemic preparedness treaty is really around who is passing that treaty. And I think there's sort of two ways it can go. The one way it can go is it can follow in the footsteps of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which has been really an unprecedented success by the WHO to really further tobacco control across the globe. But that required not just a treaty that was meaningful with really measurable targets and concrete goals, but it also required an immense amount of funding to ensure its implementation in low and middle income countries. The alternative is that it becomes something that's a bit hollow or maybe even outdated by the time it's passed. And in that spirit, I sort of think of the PIP framework that the WHO also implemented, which has not seen the same kind of uptake and has had almost minimal impact on access to influenza vaccines. So I think, it's a challenge. We've seen what power the WHO can wield, but we also know that when it comes to international bodies, money talks, and the WTO is really the body that controls a lot of this. So even if there were to be, for example, IP waivers, we still have to contend with the WTO and see some type of cooperation there for it to be meaningful.
All right. Laura, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think you've heard, interesting perspectives, coming out of some of the African Union member states about whether or not another treaty is the way to go, or whether we should just work on enforcing the existing regulations and that kind of govern this sort of stuff. So, for instance, we have the international health regulations that were passed in 2005, and they specify, that you should alert the WHO of any sort of public health emergencies, and that remains, the compliance with those regulations remains low. Member states continue to violate key provisions of that document. So it really lacks sort of a muscle or an enforcement mechanism, I think. And so I wonder, as with any new treaty, how do you make it come off the page and sort of be an enforceable thing, especially as far as where rich countries tend to have more weight at the WHO. Which is why I think you're starting to hear people talk about maybe funding the WHO differently to avoid some of those kind of conflicts of interest. And that's maybe not the best word, but some of that sort of undue pressure or influence.
Right. Okay, well, thank you so much, both of you, for sharing those very valuable insights. And I think that the key message or key learning here is that we definitely need to develop homegrown solutions to homegrown problems, given all the challenges that we face and all the pushback that we often get from high-income countries. We just need to develop our own homegrown solutions and figure things out ourselves. And we do have the capacity for it, despite many challenges that we do face. And we just need to continue, hopefully, building that capacity and eventually just protecting our populations. So I think I'm going to open up the floor to the two listeners that we have with us right now. Anybody else? Okay, Miriam, if you also have a question, please feel free to also ask that. But if you would like to ask a question, please do come up. We'll request to be invited up on stage, and then you can take the floor. If anybody would like to ask any question at all.
Sorry, I don't know why my microphone keeps unmuting.
Oh, no problem. Okay, well, it doesn't look like we have any questions at all. So maybe both of you could just give your, maybe a last, where you've really shared some very powerful sentiments and really given us some great things to think about, great food for thought. But maybe you just each want to maybe say one last statement about this issue. Laura, we can start with you.
Yeah, I think it's hard to sort of come up with anything kind of revolutionary, but I do think that we've known for a long time that the way that we price medicines is drastically broken. And then there was 2016 high-level report on this from the UN that include multiple consultations here in South Africa. So I think that we really do need to relook at a paradigm shift within research and development and IP with access to medicines, because what we're doing now is not working. And I think oftentimes we've heard pharmaceutical companies during this pandemic talk about the need to recoup costs, and just to kind of reiterate that a lot of those costs for these vaccines were paid for by taxpayer dollars. So the amount of money that they actually need to recoup, I think, is questionable, and I think we continue to sort of need to hold them to account about the sort of profiteering, hoarding, and other unsavory behaviors that sort of dominated this pandemic.
Thanks, Laura. Sephora?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think you've got two people who are very anti-business here. I have to echo that and go even further. I was quite shocked to read an article that said pharmaceutical companies slam waiver. So even this shadow of a waiver was unpalatable to them. Laura's quite right in that when it comes to the COVID-19 vaccine, majority of the funding has come from public sources. And so this kind of market recouping cost risks issue doesn't apply. But I think it goes a lot deeper than that, which is, I think, the overall system and the way in which medicines are developed is really, really deficient. It's skewed towards certain types of diseases. It's skewed towards certain types of populations. And, that's a very, very big problem. The other thing I just wanted to say, Laura mentioned, for example, the international health regulations, which I believe are currently undergoing revision, is even those regulations which were passed by the WHO are centered around preserving and minimizing impact on trade and economies. And I think we saw the downsides of that with, for example, the discovery of Omicron. As much as you can encourage people and create systems where they have to report a virus, if you're going to see countries penalizing other countries that are reporting those new variants, you're creating a system where people don't want to comply because they'll be punished for doing so. And I think that is the underscoring issue here, is until we are really able to have research and development and manufacturing happen within low and middle income countries, it doesn't seem like this issue is going away. At the same time, there's a real concern among African states that they can invest in vaccine manufacturing capacity, and then this capacity becomes a quote-unquote white elephant because it's incredibly expensive, and I'm not sure it's even necessary. We've reached a point in the pandemic, 20 months after the waiver was proposed, where there's actually enough supply. But now we've got a whole host of other problems that are preventing equitable access. And so this is just a small part of it. And I think what's become even more problematic is that pharmaceutical companies have used this as an opportunity to blame low and middle income countries as kind of the architects of their own problems. I was reading a comment from someone from Aspen where they said, well, we want to produce the vaccines. If only African countries would order from us, then we would produce them. But if they don't order from us now, then we're going to shut down our manufacturing capacity and focus it on other things. So, you can't have a situation where effectively businesses are holding low and middle income countries hostage, and specifically Africa, because this has really been a problem for Africa. It hasn't been a problem for places like India and China and Russia and places like that. And South America has been dealt with in a totally different way. So I think, this is not a simple problem. I had hoped that, the pandemic and COVID would have, cast light on these things, and there'd be more of an effort to try and address some of these systemic issues, but that hasn't happened. Hopefully it will happen before the next pandemic, but who knows?
Well, Laura and Sephora, thank you very, very much for your time and for sharing these valuable sentiments on this topic. I think it's given us a lot of food for thought about the problem with the sheer amount of power that Big Pharma holds. and has really helped us also clarify, I think, how these decisions affect people's lives on the ground, especially for those of us in the global south. And I think you've both also illustrated quite well just how important international solidarity is in times of crisis. So thank you very much for your time. Really, really appreciate you being a part of this discussion. So for our listeners, for more information about the hashtag Equality Not Charity campaign that the ICJ is running, please follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at ICJ_org, and feel free to also send us a message if you require further information about it. I also encourage you to visit our website, www.icj.org, which also has more information on the advocacy work that we have done on the TRIPS waiver, COVID-19 vaccines, access to vaccines, etc. But I think that's a good point to close. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, and good night.